NDIS provider, this might sound familiar. A few months back, we were working with a provider who just onboarded a new participant. Everything looked pretty straightforward. Support started, the team got to work, invoices were being submitted. Then, partway through the first quarter, claims started bouncing. Limits had been hit, and no one, not the provider, not the participant, had picked up that this plan had quarterly funding periods in place. So that scramble to work out what happened, why it happened, and what to do next, that's exactly what I want to help you avoid today. Because if you're finding funding periods confusing, stressful, or just a lot more admin than you were expecting, you're not alone. This is a significant structural change to how NDIS plans work, and it's catching a lot of providers off guard. So what actually changed and why? Funding periods were introduced under the new NDIS Act, and from the 19th of May 2025, they apply to all new plans. So if you want the full detail on the legislation and how the periods are structured, the team at DSC have written a really thorough article called Funding Periods Are Here, a major change for NDIS plans, and I'll link that in the description. It's worth a read. But here's the plain English version. A participant's total plan funding is now divided into time-based instalments, usually quarterly, and those instalments are released progressively. So you can't draw forward from the next period, but the unused funds do roll over into the next period within the same plan, but they don't carry over into the new plan. So the intent behind this was to spread funding more evenly across the plan and reduce the risk of funds being used up too early. And in theory, that makes sense, but here's the reality on the ground. The NDIS is also tightening spending more broadly, and not every plan is structured in a way that reflects how supports actually need to be delivered. Things like assessments, reports, behaviour support plan development, these kinds of things often need to happen early. And if the funding for them is spread evenly across quarters rather than weighted in the front of the plan, and that does happen sometimes, but not always. So if it's not, the participants and providers can find themselves stuck between delivering what's needed and staying within what the plan period allows. So it's worth understanding both sides of that. So getting intake right from the start. By the time you're mid-quarter and hitting an instalment limit, that disruption is already happening. The best place to avoid it is right at the start, before any supports begin. So there's two questions that need to be part of every intake process now. First, how is this category of funding managed? Is it agency managed, plan managed, or self-managed? It's not a new question, but it matters now more than ever. If you don't have the right answer at intake, or you receive incorrect information, claims, we all know, claims end up going through the wrong process, and that delays payments. Layer a funding period limit on top of a delayed payment, and you've got this compounding cash flow problem that's much harder to untangle. So the second question is, what are the funding periods and instalment amounts for this support? This information needs to come from the participant themselves, their nominee, or their support coordinator if they have one. Because they can see it in the participant portal, what those funding amounts are. So getting this at intake before a single support is delivered means you can set up your tracking correctly from day one. And then this part actually protects you. Use that information. Once you know what's available for the quarter, that information then needs to get to the people planning and rostering supports. It's not always easy to coordinate across a clinical team, a rostering team, the back office. I totally get that. But breaking that quarterly figure down into roughly monthly or the weekly picture and making sure the people scheduling support can actually see that is what stops you hitting that limit too soon. So getting the information is step one. Acting on it is the step that makes a big difference. And I know that sounds so obvious, but I've seen not everybody is doing that. So when your systems aren't made for this, even when providers are asking the right questions at intake, the next challenge is whether your system can actually manage that information. So we've been working with a support coordination provider recently who uses a less common CRM. It's okay software, but it's not built with those funding periods in mind, and they haven't updated it. It could track the total plan funding, but had no way to separately track quarterly instalments. So their workaround was to set up the funding tracking to run from the start of the plan to the end of the current quarter, clearly labelled as instalment one of however many periods in that plan. And then we set up a manual reminder to update the figures at the start of each quarter. It works, but it takes extra time every quarter, and it lives outside of that software. And the risk of human error, obviously, is higher. If you're reviewing your own systems, the key questions to ask are, can it track both total plan funding and instalment periods separately? And can it alert you when a period limit, a quarterly limit, is getting close? If the answer is no, it's worth knowing that now rather than finding out when claims start bouncing or invoices keep getting rejected. If you do hit a funding period limit, the NDIS direction is fairly clear, so stop delivering supports until the next period opens. Don't continue delivering services and holding claims to submit later. That DSC article sort of flags that as a bit of a compliance risk. And that said, I do want to acknowledge though the hard reality. Some supports, pausing isn't as straightforward or safe. If the supports your participant receives are time sensitive or essential to their well-being, it's not a decision to make sort of across the board, we're going to stop if it hits the limits. So in those situations, we need to contact the participant's NDIS planner or their support coordinator as quickly as possible to discuss whether a plan variation or internal review is appropriate. And whenever you can, have those conversations before you get to that limit hit, not afterwards. If you can see in your system that you're approaching the end of the funds for a period, that's when it's time to make that decision, not like when your invoices start bouncing. So what if it's already getting away from you? Maybe you're watching this and the intake process is sorted, systems are good and in shape, brilliant, awesome. But maybe you're watching this because things have already started to snowball a little bit. The backlog is building up, the team is flat out with keeping up with the day-to-day intake and billing, and there's no spare capacity to go back and audit what's been claimed against like what period limits actually are, figuring out those issues. And that's the point where a backlog stops being a manageable problem and starts getting expensive. If that's where you're at, our cash flow revival service is designed especially for that situation where the problem exists but the internal bandwidth to fix it doesn't. It might be worth a conversation. I'll put the details in the description below, no obligations at all. But to bring it back to the things that make the biggest difference, again, get your intake right, ask about management types and funding periods right at the beginning before you start services, and get that information direct from the participant or the support coordinator. Then actually use it for your scheduling. Check your systems, make sure they can track instalment limits and not just total funding. It's keeping track of as the funding is being used and knowing when you're getting close to that limit to be able to make decisions about continuing or not. Funding periods are a structural shift, not one-off, they're not going away. But with the right processes in place, they're manageable. If you've got questions or a scenario that you're working through, pop them in the comments or send me a message We'll have some links for further information below this. Yeah, I know it's not easy right now. The admin burden is bigger than ever. We're definitely seeing that with our clients. So trying to work out the systems and processes that will alleviate some of it is what we're here for. So I hope that helps, and we'll see you next time.